Hello again. Okay, so we are still in chapter 8 of Exodus. First 15. Then we had 4 verses on the plague of lice. And the last 15 verses are going to deal with the plague of flies. So, and like I said, the plague of lice, they really didn't end it so well, or, it was very compressed, the information on it. The ending of it, they didn't mention it ending. They just mentioned magician said, "We can't do this. This must be the finger of God." And Pharaoh's heart was hardened. We're sort of assuming that it was ended sometime in there. And then we jump straight to verse 20 and we go straight to the plague of flies. So it's like there's really no conclusion to the plague of lice. So we jump to verse 20 and 21. And the Lord said unto Moses, Rise up early in the morning, and stand before Pharaoh. Lo, he cometh forth to the water. And say unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Let my people go, that we may serve me. Else, if thou wilt not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies upon thee, and upon thy servants, and upon thy people, and unto thy house and the houses of the Egyptians shall be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground whereupon they are. And I will sever in that day the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell. So, verse 22, we get to the important part here. And this is one of those things, people talking about the 10 plagues, they will point out that the fourth one is the first one where the Israelites weren't affected by it. And we only really get that when we get to the fourth one. It's the water was blood throughout the land. There were frogs throughout the land. And we don't really even think about, other than the fact that, people have been reading this for thousands of years, and therefore we think about it. If we just read it from the Bible, without, other people's previous commentaries, we don't think, wait a second, the Israelites are being hit by these plagues too. So we get the first one where the Bible itself comes out and says, no, this time the Israelites are going to be spared. And so, if you're reading it for the first time and haven't heard any previous commentary, you might have the sudden light bulb go off and say, oh yeah, the first 3 were hitting the Israelites too. Now, doesn't say what kind of flies. I mean, this is the sort of thing you read through it, and I think if you're living in America or parts of Europe, you read through this and you think, houseflies, which are annoying. Yeah, they can be. This goes back to the whole thing with the plague of frogs. Was it any real danger to it, or was it just a huge nuisance? And flies are a huge nuisance. They buzz, they make sounds, they get on stuff. We think of them as spreading disease and all that, but the Egyptians worshipped dung beetles. They were less concerned about diseases. Probably had some. I mean, they were associated with dead bodies. They so might see the flies as unclean in that manner. But again, we're thinking houseflies. This is northeastern Africa. Africa's got some nasty insects. When I say a plague of insects or a plague of flies, speaking of Africa, I could be talking about all sorts of nasty insects that we wouldn't consider here in America. Someone in Africa say a plague of flies to someone in Africa, and they'll be like, "Yeah, this is worse than you think it is," because they got all sorts of biting insects, and so were these just a nuisance or were these biting flies? And the Bible doesn't tell us. Was a plague was happening in northeast Africa, where they do have some nasty biting insects. So it is quite possible that this was more horrendous than we can imagine here in America. Now, back roughly 2004, 2005, somewhere around there, went to Australia. and they were having a fly problem down there, as in more flies than normal. And again, this was your typical housefly type. And there was one guy, one news broadcaster, made the reference to it's like a biblical plague. Nah, I don't think so. More flies than I was used to, yes. Biblical plagues worth of flies, no. And again, those were just like your normal house flies. They weren't your biting variety or anything like that, because about 20 years before then, or maybe even 30 years before then, can't remember exactly, went to camp in Minnesota. And they got some nasty horseflies up there. And horseflies will bite. And this, no one described this as a plague of horseflies. This was summer in Minnesota. So that was, in my mind, more of a plague than what was happening in Australia 20 years later. But even then, that was normal for Minnesota. So we got these biting flies, but not a plague yet. So now we go back and we look at ancient Egypt, and they talk about a plague of flies, and read it in that perspective. This was probably something somewhat nasty. Again, it doesn't say what kind of flies. I'm going to go off and assume they were probably some sort of biting flies. Because again, otherwise, it's a nuisance more than anything else. And yes, I wouldn't want house flies all over the place. But compared to biting flies, I think I could put up with more house flies than I could other types of flies. So I'm going to assume what was happening in Egypt was much worse. Now, one thing about all this is something new starts happening here. So first, go back to chapters 3 and 4, basically. Moses is at the burning bush. Go, let my people go. Tell Pharaoh he's got to let my people go. I will bring them up. I'm going to bring them up to a new land, a well-watered land, and paradise on earth compared to what else was going on earth at the time. Basically, the land of Canaan, the land I promised your fathers, etc. Moses goes to Egypt. A couple chapters later, talking to Pharaoh. Let my people go that they may worship in the wilderness. We just want to go 3 days into the wilderness so we can worship our God. And wait a second. No, you don't. Your plan is to leave entirely. You're not going to come back in 3 days. And so Moses, now we start the negotiations here. And Moses continues this lie of we're only going 3 days in the wilderness. And if you think about it, yes, Moses lied this whole time about what was going on. He didn't say, hey, Pharaoh, our God's going to take us away and that's the end of it. No, we just want to go. We just want to worship our God a few days. And we'll be back. And so Moses is lying the entire time. We don't think about that, but let's face it, that's really what's happening. And so we start negotiations. And so at this point, Pharaoh's saying, look, you can worship your God, just do it in the land here. And Moses turns around and says, nope, we're going to be sacrificing a lamb. One of your gods has a ram's head, I believe. I was going to look this up, I forgot to. I believe Ra is sometimes, not Ra, Osiris, I think. Osiris, which is one of the major ones, is often portrayed as having a ram's head. Could be wrong on that. I'll correct myself later. And so we can't sacrifice it here or we'll just be offending the Egyptians and all sorts of troubles will happen. And so they argue about this for a while. And Pharaoh said, I will let you go that you may sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness, only you shall not go very far away. Entreat for me. So, okay, Pharaoh finally agrees. We'll let you go your 3 days journey, but don't go too far. And Moses is like, sure, no problem, even though the original plan is we're never coming back. Moses continues to lie. Um, and this is one of those things, it sounds like I'm making Moses out to be a horrible person, and no, he's, it's a question of his faith here, I think. He's been told God's going to take the people away. He's seen all these miracles. He knows it can happen. And yet, he doesn't want to tell Pharaoh the entire truth. So that's something, again, for the rest of us to learn from. On the one hand, Moses wasn't perfect. On the other hand, people who have seen greater miracles enough have gotten very scared. And so we shouldn't feel guilty when our faith wavers a little bit. So overall, that's the main part of it. Like I said, we're going to go back and forth on these negotiations as we go through other plagues. Oh yeah, so another thing I was going to look up and forgot to. This actually happened with the whole sacrificing of a lamb. Happened, I think, around 300 BC. I could be wrong. I was going to look this up. Babylon came, overthrew Jerusalem. People were taken away as slaves. Well, not slaves. Well, some of them were slaves. Some were just captives. The Jewish diaspora started, so they were sort of scattered from the promised land. And so there was a colony in southern Egypt of Jews. And they were, it was like south of, it was somewhere along the Nile. Again, I was going to look this up. I forgot to. But sometime around 300 BC, they wrote a letter to the Jews who had returned to Jerusalem under the whole, Cyrus allowed them to return and rebuild the temple. And they were like, okay, we're having some problems here. We want to keep the Passover. We want to sacrifice a lamb. The Egyptians around here are still worshiping the old gods, so us sacrificing a lamb is still an insult to them, and they're really threatening us. And so what are we going to do about it? And the Jews at Jerusalem said, sorry, the temple's here in Jerusalem, you can't sacrifice down there. And pretty much said, we're not going to do anything. But just wanted to point out that the whole idea, Moses' argument, the Bible calls it, our sacrifice is an abomination to the Egyptians, is the way the Bible describes it, or the King James at least. And people have, interpreted that as we are sacrificing a lamb, and you've got this ram-headed God who we don't want to insult people. If we try to do this, they're going to break up our celebration and start fighting us, and we don't want that. And so this actually did happen about, 500 or 600 years later. Again, I forgot to look this up, otherwise I'd have better dates on it. Might come back to this point next time, and I started making this video before I remembered that I was going to look it up. I thought about it last night and just didn't get around to doing the research. But that's just more of an aside than anything else. But it's sort of an interesting aside. I mean, one of the reasons I do these videos is one thought leads to another thought. And, this is a connected point in history. Let's sort of look at it, even though it's not really a direct connection. So, like I said, I will probably look that up and next video have more information on it. More accurate information. I just, now in the middle of filming, thought about it. So that was it. Pharaoh's heart was hardened again after the swarms were gone. Um, there's one other point I want to make, but it's better made on a future plague. So I'm sort of holding off on that. This is sort of the, I don't know, not the big reveal, but it is something to think about. It's the nature of the plagues themselves. So that's something that, I think around the sixth or seventh plague, I will be coming back to the whole idea of the flies and the lice and the frogs and the blood. But for now, I'm just going to leave it as a spoiler or a teaser. Other than that, that's about it. One last thing. And Moses went out from Pharaoh and entreated the Lord, and the Lord did according to the word of Moses, and he removed the swarm of flies from Pharaoh, and from his servants, and from his people. There remained not one. So, this wasn't like the frogs where you just have a bunch of dead flies laying around now. No, the flies left on their own accord. And that's something we don't think about, is how the plagues end. This time around, he just took the flies away. That was actually better than they've had in the past. We don't have heaps of dead frogs around. We don't have heaps of dead flies around now. So they got off a little easier. That's one of the reasons I think maybe this was a worse plague than it looks like. Maybe the flies did bite, and God said, okay, you've had enough suffering. I'll take them away completely. We don't know that for sure. Again, one of the reasons I'm doing this series is we read through this stuff so fast and we don't think about, okay, so flies. What's wrong with flies? Well, they might bite. They might not bite. The Bible doesn't tell us which. So it just gets me thinking, and it's stuff to think about. That's it. Have a nice day.